Welcome to the tutorial for the Danehill coat. We're going to start off by doing our welt pocket. So I'm going to show you how I've marked mine out. You'll see that the size I've marked in a colour, and I've put an extra bit of interfacing underneath where my welt's going to go. I've marked this colour so that I know this is my size. It's really clear because it can be a bit confusing if there are a lot of lines. I'd recommend you do that around all your pattern pieces. And I'm just popping a pin into these corner points so that I can transfer these markings onto my fabric. There we go. So you'll see they already correspond with the little crosses that I'd put on, and you can see that rectangle's about 1 centimetre in every dimension larger than my welt pocket will be. So just pull these out a little bit so I don't lose them. And I'm going to mark with some chalk where these pins come through the fabric, and that will give me a good starting point for marking out my pocket. Okay, so this is my waistline and this is my pockets where it's going to go, so it's going to fold upwards. So this is going to be where I lay my welt to. Obviously I'll do it a bit neater in a minute. So now we need to prep the welt. Here we go. I've got 2 welts here, and I've got, these are my pockets that are cut out of lining. I've got a back pocket and a front pocket here, so you can see one is just slightly longer, and the idea is that when you put your welt on and everything, they should be the same size when you turn them through, but we'll come to that later. So welts here, they've been interfaced obviously. I've cut 2. I'm just going to fold them in half lengthways like that and just stitch down these ends. There we go. We'll clip the corners. Just grade that little bit there just to make it a bit less bulky, and then you can turn them through. If you've got a turning tool, you might need to use it to help release the points. I'm going to use a pencil, but again I'd recommend you use a tool or a blunt knitting needle. There we go, just tease those out a little bit. They just need a press. So there we go, welt's done. Okay, so now we're going to stitch these welts on with the pocket bags. There you go, I've smartened that line up nice and straight. Here's my welt pocket. I'm going to just place that on. That's how it's going to look when it's sewn. So I need to flip it over, and I want to align the raw edge with that chalk line. Pop a pin in. Now we've got the pocket bag. That's the front one. This is the back one. Remember, the back one's slightly longer. Now I've got a right side and a wrong side to my lining. So that's the front one. I'm going to place the fabric the right side down towards the coat, so it's right sides together, and you want to imagine that you're going to fold it back through the hole. So that's how you want your pocket to look. That's my waist, so you're going to put your hand down towards the hem. So right sides together, just double check that, and then I'm going to match these raw edges up together, pop some pins in. You can hand sew these, tack it in place as well. That's a sensible option. Now this is my back pocket, so I need it to face that way, but that's the wrong side, so I need that one. So that's how it should look. And then when you fold it through, that right side will be showing inside the pocket. So lay those raw edges together. Again, right side down. And we're going to pop a couple of pins in. And then we're going to stitch. We'll do the welt first. I'm going to rest my machine foot on the edge, on that raw edge. And I'm going to stitch from this welt. So my first stitch will go in the edge of the welt. Don't go over the welt, stay within it. So I'll pop a little pin in there. I can feel it through as it's quite a hard ridge. And I'm going to stitch, and then I'm going to stitch the other pocket bag on as well. So here we go. So resting the edge of my sewing machine foot, which is about 1 centimetre away from the edge, back tack to start, and carefully stitch all the way through to the other end of the welt. Don't overshoot. You can always hand wheel that last stitch or two to avoid going over. Back tack and come off. And then I'm going to do the same with the other pocket bag. I'm going to start just inside that previous line, but I'm going to put the edge of my foot on that raw edge. So back tack to start, back tack to finish. Okay, so here we go. You can see, I'll show you a close-up of those stitch lines. You can see the lower one has got the welt underneath it, and the top one is the pocket bag back, which is not got the welt. So that's my waist and my hem, and that's how my pocket's going to be when I push it through this hole. So that's my first stitch line that stitched the welt on, and then you can see that second line is just a couple of stitches shorter than the first one. And then I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to cut through the centre here, making little triangles at the end. You can draw it on first if you want to, but I'll just show you exactly what the shape is going to be that I'm going to cut. So those snips go right to that last stitch. Use very sharp scissors. Be careful not to stitch your cut your stitching. There we go, nice sharp point on these. Keep your pocket bags out of the way, you don't want to cut into those. And I'm going to start in the middle and just snip carefully and slowly, parallel to those lines, till I get to about 1 centimetre from the end, and then I'm going to angle it in and snip into that last stitch. Don't go beyond the stitching. Okay, those all important triangles. Here we go. Make sure again that the fabric's out the way. You don't want a hole in your pocket before you've even started. And I'm going to snip towards that last stitch again. That's it, right into that corner, forming a lovely little neat triangle at the end. It's quite thick at this point, so just take your time and just nibble away at the fabric with the scissors. There we go. Right into that stitch. Okay. Okay, so now we've got our pocket bags attached and we've cut our hole. I'm going to push these through. Now this needs a little bit of fiddling because you need to find these all important little triangles on the end. So you'll just need to gently pull these into place and pull them through, and then the idea is that we poke as much of the lining through as we can. I'm going to give it a little press, I think, to start with, just to sort of hold it in place a little bit. Let's poke those little triangles through. Yeah, I'll give it a press to hold it down a little bit. So I've just given it a bit of steam. So I don't want to loosen off all the interfacing. So that's my waist, there's my welt. You can see how it's pointing up the right way. And this is my pocket bag, so my hand can go into it. That's my waist again, so it's pointing downwards towards the hem. Right side's on the inside of the lining, hooray. And there's my little triangle, which is a bit better now. I've given it a little steam. It's lying a bit flatter, so I'm going to start at one triangle, and I'm going to stitch the lining to it. Let's turn it over so I can show you. So back tack as close to the base there as I can get. I'll show you again once it's stitched, it'll be clearer. And then I'm going to stitch all around that pocket bag till I get to the other triangle, and then I'll back tack again. Let's go. So here we go. Back tack to start on that triangle to secure it as firmly as possible. And then I'm just going to zhuzh round my pocket bag, just laying the edge of the foot to the edge of the fabric here. Off we go. And then we'll get to that final triangle at the other side, and again it's just pulling it all out and laying it all as flat as possible, and get as close into the base of that triangle as I can. And a back tack. So let's show you how that looks in real life. There we go, all stitched down. It needs a little bit of a press, but I'll show you these triangles. Look, there you go, I've got in as close as I can to the base of the triangle. And now I'm going to give that another little steam. There we are. It's looking very swish. So I'm going to now just pin down this welt, and I will hand sew these edges of the welt to the jacket. You might want to do it on your sewing machine, that's fine. I like them hand stitched. I think they look a bit nicer, a bit more polished. So literally just going to take needle and thread. I start in the middle of the welt because the top of the welt gets the most wear and the most sort of stress on it really when you're wearing it. So I don't want to make that the weakest point, which would be where I've started and finished. And I'm going to work my way back down to the middle and to the base. And then work back again just to make it doubly sure and secure. There we go. So stitch the other side and then you're done. That's your welt pocket. So now we're going to do the side seams of the lower coat. This is my back, the sort of skirt part, I suppose. That's my centre back at the top and the waist. These are my side seams, and these are my fronts with my lovely pockets in. And I'm just going to lay those right sides together and pin the side seams. One centimetre seam allowance as always on this pattern, unless otherwise stated. I'm going to stitch from waist to hem, back tack to start, back tack to finish. There we go. And then I'm just going to press this seam open. There we go, nice flat seam. I've used a seam roll. If you've not seen one before, this is mine. And basically I lay my seam right on the edge there, so that I'm literally just pressing into the crease, into the stitching, and these bits lie flat, so you don't get that nasty shine or the mark of the seam allowance on the right side. I think it makes a little bit of a difference, so it's worth investing if you're interested. Let's do some darts. Here are my upper front panels. You can see my darts here. Again, I'd suggest marking all of this out in a coloured pen in your size so that you don't get confused as to what's what. I've marked with a little snip at the bottom of the dart, and I've got that pin in the top. There we go. And then I'm just going to pull that pin through. Don't forget to mark all your other notches. There's important ones around your collar. This is your break point, and your armhole as well. So that will be the point of my dart. So I'm pulling that through so that I can see exactly where it is. And then pop a pin in on the wrong side. Again, you can see I've interfaced all of this coat, all on the inside. Match those notches. I like to interface when I'm doing a sort of smart semi-tailored garment because I think it gives strength. Stitch from the widest point to the point. There we go. I'm going to press that flat and then press it to one side. I usually press towards the side seams. There we go. Now we've got darts on the back, so we follow the same process. I'm going to fold my pattern piece in half and then mark those through again. Again, don't forget your other armhole notches when you're cutting out. So follow my line down, follow my line down, and then mark the point of the dart. Okay, so now we're just going to fold these, join the little snips that we did for the start of the dart, and stitch from the widest point to the point. There we go. Again, I'm going to press those flat and then press them towards the, well, you can press them towards the side seams or the centre back. I like to press them towards the centre back. Next job, side seams and shoulder seams on this bodice. So here we go, nicely pressed pieces. Right sides together. You can see my patchwork interfacing there. I don't like waste, so I will always use little pieces when I can. That's your shoulders pinned and last side seam. These are slightly short side seams because the waist on this is slightly higher, slightly raised. I think it's a more flattering look. There we go, centimetre seam allowance again, all stitched. We're going to press these open. I'm going to use my seam roll again. That's what it looks like from the right side. Job done. So now we're going to pop the sleeves together. These sleeves are two pieces. I think this is a nice shape for a slightly more formal sort of coat, slightly more tailored looking. So you've got an undersleeve and an upper sleeve, and if you look, it should slightly curve a bit like a banana. So this bit is your elbow and that's your inside of your arm. So you need a pair of each of those. Make sure you mark on your notches, that's for your underarm. This is your fold line for your sleeve length. So obviously you'll have toiled, so you'll know exactly how long you want your sleeves. So let's take one pair of sleeve pieces. So again, match any notches. And remember, you need outside curves together and inside curves together. There's that nice little angle at the bottom, which is where the cuff turns up inside the coat. So don't cut that straight, make sure it goes outwards. And just keep pinning right up until the top. Great, so centimetre seam allowance again, we're going to stitch both these seams. There we go. Give them a press open. Again, I will use my sleeve board or my sleeve roll if I can get it through there. Just a couple of clips in the seam. There we go. It's not very curvy, so you don't really need to clip very much. That is where I've marked where that fold line was, so that I can turn the hem up when it's time to do so. It's worthwhile popping that in. Sleeve done. So now we're going to pop these sleeves in. So grab the top part of your coat again, and again remember they curve, so this one curves that way, so it's going to be a right sleeve. So I'm putting that into the right hand side of my coat. You have also got double notches which denote the back and single notches which denote the front. This is the notch that goes to the side seam, which is sort of in the middle of that under sleeve. So top notch matches to the shoulder seam. Where is it? There it is. Pop a pin in there. Then we're going to lay the sleeve inside the armhole, and I always pin and stitch from inside the sleeve head. That notch there matches with where that seam hits the armhole. And there's a tiniest bit of ease in the sleeve head, not very much, so they're pretty simple to put in. So again, pinning all the way around. Do tack them in if that makes you feel more confident. I'm going to start in the underarm and I'm going to stitch from the inside of the sleeve. Centimetre seam allowance. Make sure any seams are lying flat and open. And gently ease that sleeve head into the armhole. There we go, one sleeve in. Take these pins out. You can see it fits in quite nicely. Let's have a look from the other side, make sure there's no puckers. Beautiful, give that a little steam. That's what it looks like once it's steamed. Nicely inserted sleeve. Just the other one to do now. So next we're going to stitch the collar to the coat. Okay, so that's the top of my coat. And I've got one of the two colours. These are the notches that we need to mark. Let's fold this in half. And I will make sure I transfer these notches as accurately as possible. Again, it's worth marking in a coloured pen or pencil or crayon or something to make it a bit easier for you to identify where your lines and notches are. This one is for the shoulder seam. The other one's where the collar and revere meet. And we've done the centre back neck, which will make sure we've got that on the actual jacket as well. So that's on there. So I need to fold this in half and get the centre back neck point onto our coat neck. Okay, let's pin those together. I'm going to match the other notch to the shoulder seam. And then we're going to mark these corners. I'm going to use a pencil just to make sure I can do this as accurately as possible, because at the end of the day that's going to make it look so much neater and a really nice crisp finish if you can do this as precisely as possible. So that's my centimetre seam allowance I'm marking now with my pencil. Let's do that a little bit more nicely. So centimetre, so it's where they cross that spot. That is where my pin is going to go. That's the crucial point. And I'm going to do the same on this corner of the collar now. I'm going to mark the centimetre seam allowance, and where they cross is where I want my pin to go. So right there. So I'm going to grab a pin, pop it through that point there, and then through the other point on the collar, so that I know they're exactly in line for when I start stitching. So I will start stitching on that spot, back tack a little bit, and then go all the way along and do the same here. Stop at the spot on the corner there. So we're starting at that spot on one end, little back tack, centimetre seam allowance, stitching the collar neckline to the jacket neckline, all the way around to the other spot, the other corner of the collar, where we back tack. Here we go. So that's it. It's all gone on quite nicely and smoothly. So you can see, oh, there's a little bit of a thread there. So I'm just going to snip into that corner, and I'm going to manipulate that fabric round the corner now of the collar, lying flat. Those notches should match where the collar and revere are stitched together. So starting where I left off, put a pin in there and then a pin where the notch is. There it is. That's exactly where I need to stop. So I'll stitch there, back tack, and finish at the corner again. So centimetre seam allowance, finding that notch, stopping as precisely as I can, and back tack. So there we go, we've got two corners where our collar's been sewn onto our jacket neckline and stitched to the revere, sort of halfway along. Now I'm just going to clip into the neckline and any curves, trim away anything that's a bit bulky, and give it a little press. I'll be opening this seam. There we go, all pressed open. I clip those corners. That's the first part of your collar in. So now we're going to basically repeat the same process on the facing. This is my back neck facing, which we're going to attach to the collar facing first of all. This I've block cut, which is where I've ironed on the interfacing first and then cut it out afterwards, and I'm putting on my notches. There's also notches on your facing here. This is your break point again. Let's open it up, and the back neck facing basically fits in between these two. Quick pin, line up all your edges. We're going to stitch that a centimetre in. There we go, pressed open. That's the first bit. Now we're going to have our second collar piece, and we're going to pop it into that space. So again, we're marking the centimetre seam allowances as we did before to find those points where we need to put our pin to make sure it's as accurate as possible. Get a really nice crisp corner on our collar. There we go, let's just darken these lines a bit so you can see them a bit better. Here's our collar again. And we're going to mark seam allowances on the corners again here. Taking the time to do this little bit of prep really is worthwhile because, again, accuracy when you're doing anything on a coat like a collar or a pocket is where it's at really. So just enjoy the process. There we go, we're going to find the centre back neck of our back neck facing. Little snip there. Do the same on our collar, find the centre back neck. Okay, we're ready to go. So match those centre back notches. Now we're going to find those intersections and pop a pin exactly in where that crosses. And as I said before, this is basically exactly the same as what we've just done. So we're going to be stitching point to point. So match your notch to your side shoulder seam, sorry. And you're going to stitch from one point to the next, back tacking at the start and the finish, centimetre seam allowance as before. Trying your best to start and stop exactly on that spot. So there we are. Start and stop on the spot. We can do a bit of clipping and press that open. And then we can do this other little, we've clipped into that corner and we're just going to do the other little seam there, joining the collar to the revere up to that notch. We'll do that both sides. And then you can press that seam open and you're ready to go. There we are, we're all pressed open, we've been clipped and trimmed. We're ready to put that onto the actual coat now. Okay, so we're going to attach the facing now to the collar that's already on the coat. And this is kind of where the magic happens really. This is where it becomes a proper collar and revere. So here's my facing. I'm going to put these right sides together and I want to find the collar on my coat and that spot where we started to stitch. I need to find that and then find the corresponding one on the actual coat, which is there. So I'm going to put a pin through that spot again and the corresponding spot on the other collar. That's going to be my starting point or finishing point. Pull everything out the way as much as you can underneath so that you're not catching anything in. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. So find that spot again, that's start and stop, and on the corresponding part of the coat collar, and secure it with a pin. Do tack or whatever else makes you feel more confident at this point. Then I'm going to pin this outside edge just of the collar at the moment. We're going to forget about the reveres. We're just going to do from this point here all the way around to that point there and back tack. So here we go. Back tack to start, and then we're going to go all the way around. Take your time as the corners are quite sharp, so you want to get them as even as possible, following that outside edge. Centimetre seam allowance as usual. There we are, so you can see I've started and stopped. It now looks like a continuous row of stitching, doesn't it, all the way around, because I've started and stopped at that point. Next it's doing the same again but on the revere, so I find that start point and pop a pin through from one side to the other, making sure they are through the same point on both reveres, and pin. And then you can pin the two shapes together. Pin that facing down the centre front. So you're going to start from there and go stitch downwards, down towards the waist. So there we go, we've gone from that point again, started from there and gone around the curve to the waistline. So now all that's left is to ever so carefully grade the facing and to clip into the curved areas where the curves are most curvy. The tighter the curve, the more often you need to snip in. Be ever so careful that you don't snip your stitching. And basically just trim down as much as you can without getting too close to the stitch line, because you don't want anything to fray. It just reduces the bulk a little bit. A bit more clipping. Now you need to find your break point. I'd already marked it, so I'm just going to make that more exaggerated, and now I need to trim, because when I come to edge stitch, understitch even, I'm going to stitch one way for this bottom bit, and then I'm going to stitch the other way when I get to the collar. So you'll need to grade one side for the revere and the other side at the bottom there, that little centre front piece just below the break point of your collar. All will become clear in a moment when I show you my understitching. Like I say, take your time doing this bit as well, because it will make a big difference to the finish of your collar. Okay, I'm all trimmed. So we just need to turn it through now. And we're going to do some understitching on the bits that we can reach. I think some of the curves are very tight, so you won't be able to get your machine in there. Don't worry about that. Just do the bits that are easily accessible. So turning it all through. Okay, so you can get a rough idea of how it's going to look, but believe me, this will look so much better once we've understitched. Okay, so remember there's our break point there, and we're going to push this seam allowance towards the facing at the bottom, just this sort of small 4 or 5 centimetres. And then once we get up to the collar, we're going to flip it and stitch the other side. Okay, so first of all, we're doing that first little piece. So stitching and stopping. Now I am flipping underneath the seam allowance underneath to the other side, and I'm stitching the other side of that seam line, and I'm going to do that as far as I can all the way up and around the revere. When I've got as far as I can up to the revere, you can see I'm sort of having a little bit of a fumble there, and I'm now on the collar. I've gone past the really tight curve of the collar, and I'm just on a bit that's not quite so tight, and I'm pulling that seam allowance again to the same side that I did with the revere and stitching close to the seam there, just to hold that seam allowance against that part of the collar. Keep going, and again you want to keep going until you get to the end here. Look, this is the break point again, where I'm going to stop, come off, flip that seam allowance over to the other side and stitch again. Okay, let me see if I can show you. Let's see how clear this comes out on the camera. You can see, look, there's understitching. So that's the collar part, all understitched. And then you've got the revers here. And that's got understitching there on the top. And then when we go down to that break point, you'll see it stops and then it goes onto the other side. So you'll see it better if I flip it over, look. So it's only that few centimetres at the bottom that's the other side. Let's give it a press. So this is where it really starts to show you how lovely that collar is. Doing all that understitching will help you get a lovely crisp edge. So now we're going to attach the top of our coat to the bottom of our coat at the waist. Here's that lovely top part with the collar that we've just done. And this is the sort of skirt part, I suppose, below the waist. So we want the centre back notch there and find the centre back of our back panel. On there somewhere, there it is. Pop those together and pin. Side seam should match. And then we're going to pin. You should have a notch there that matches the dart positioning at the front. Pop a pin in, make sure the raw edge of the dart is in line with the waistline there. And then it should match the centre front there. And pin, there we go. Pin anything else that needs it. Again, there's notches for the darts, making sure everything's flush with the edge. The raw edges are all together. Side seams. And another dart. And your fronts. So just need to stitch those together, centimetre seam allowance from one end to the other. And there we go, we've stitched it. So centimetre seam allowance, we've pressed it open. That's our coat together. Okay, so I'm going to put some shoulder pads in my coat. It's up to you if you want to or not. I'm just using centimetre deep ones, which that refers to this depth here. They're only small and they're very soft. They're sort of felt. And you can see there's a little marker there. This is how you tell if the fronts from the backs. That's where the shoulder seam needs to go, on the little circle. And then you've got, if you can see, it's got a slightly longer tail. That's the front, that's the back. So I'm going to pop these in, and that's the underside that you're looking at there as well. That's the top. So I'm going to match that little spot there with this the shoulder seam. So there's the little spot. There's the shoulder seam, making sure that the front's going to the front and the back's going to the back. And all I'm going to do is line up that edge with the seam line there, and that with the seam line there, and then literally just take a tiny bit of the wadding and attach it to the seam allowance. You don't want it to show on the other side of the coat, so it doesn't get a lot of stress and strain, so a couple of little stitches should be enough to hold it in place. So you're going to just do this in several places. There we go, that's enough to secure that. And then we're going to work our way around and just stitch it down again, following that line of stitching around the armhole. I'm literally just going to stitch this to the seam allowance with a couple of stitches. You'll notice I'm not doing it right at the point. I'm a couple of centimetres back from there, maybe 3 or 4. And again, seam allowance so that it doesn't show. That's just to sort of keep it in place. Once the lining's in and everything, it won't really move around. And then this edge here as well, to the seam allowance near the neckline. There we go. So that's it. This is how it looks on the outside. We're just going to check that we can't see any stitch lines through, which we can't, so that's good. Now I've got a little piece of wadding here. You don't have to do this is optional, as are the shoulder pads really, but I'm just going to stitch again this onto the seam allowance here. And this is maybe 4 centimetres by the length of the shoulder pad, so it sort of starts at one end of the shoulder pad and finishes at the other. I'm literally just going to do a little running stitch to sew this into the sleeve head. Like I said, it's attached to the seam allowance, not to the actual sleeve. And it will just form a nice soft edge to the shoulder. There we go, and cut that bit off. So you can see it just sits inside the sleeve head underneath the shoulder pad, and it'll sort of keep that a nice curved edge. There we go, it just softens that area there. That looks very nice. So the next bit is constructing the lining, which is basically the same as the jacket. So I'll just show you the differences. This is my lining. It has got a right and a wrong side. It's rather nice, but you can see I've got a 2-part sleeve, so it's just the same as the jacket. And I've got a pleat in the centre back neck, which is also echoed at the centre back waist on the top part and on the sort of skirt part as well. Still got a pin in there. That's just to allow a little bit of extra for movement so that you doesn't tear when you're going in and out. So that's really the only difference. Obviously the fronts are a little slightly different shape because they attach to the facings. Don't forget you've got notches. That will help you when you're putting your lining into your coat to match those to the facing. But you don't need to finish any edges or anything because it's all going to be inside. Okay, so we're ready to pop this lining in now. You can see I've got wrong sides together here, and I'm going to put my arm inside this sleeve through the lining and the coat, and I'm doing this so that it doesn't get twisted, so I know the lining isn't twisted inside the sleeve. I'm going to pull that out and just pin those seams together. Before I then pull it all through again. Carefully without losing those pins or stabbing myself. So I want to gently pull it through and find that cuff. And now I'm just going to transfer those pins so that the right side of the lining is pinned to the right side of the coat. There we go, matching those seams again. This is just a method I find the easiest way to stop my lining getting twisted and getting all confused by which seam's which on the sleeves. There we go, right sides together. And then I'm just going to pull up or pull the sleeve down into the lining a little bit so that I can get inside, and I'll stitch from the coat side, centimetre seam allowance again through the coat cuff and the lining cuff, and just stitch all around the edge. You can see my lining's getting a bit hairy already. I would recommend that you cut all your coat pieces out first and then don't even think about the lining until you've made the coat, because they do tend to fray. Linings are quite notorious for that. So there we go. That's the lining attached to the coat at the cuff. Now remember this little guy here. This was the fold in the cuff. So now I'm going to take this, just the seam allowance, and I'm going to fold it on that notch, and I'm just going to stitch the seam allowance to the seam allowance. And this is just on the coat. This will hold the hem of the coat sleeve up inside the sleeve so that it doesn't fall down or roll down when you're wearing it, and it just forms a nicer edge. Keeps everything in place. So let's have a look through. There's some more hairy bits. Let's get rid of those. Fabulous. Yeah, that's not moving. You can see that's securely in place. Get rid of that little bit there. So that just needs a steam, and that's done. So let's put the rest of this lining into our coat. Okay, so this is our centre back neck. Do run a line around your lining neckline if you need to, if you're worried it's going to stretch. So we've got the centre back notch there for the facing, and we're going to find the centre back of our lining. And as I said before, you should have lots of notches around your lining and your coat edge, facing edge, so that you know exactly where everything needs to go. So once you've got your centre back necks together, then you basically work down towards the hem, pinning, finding a notch and pinning as you go, and then just filling in between the notches with some extra pins. There's a seam, that's your shoulder seam of your lining, and the seam on your facing. So a pin in there, and we need to find the next notch. There it is. And on our lining, yep, there it is. And just keep pinning as you go. Just working back the other way now, so that's the other shoulder seam on the lining and the seam on the facing. Pin those together, and again work your way down to the hem via the notches. Pinning as you go. This is the waist seam on your lining to the waist seam on your coat, and then it's all just straight down to the hem. So you're just going to stitch from sort of a centimetre from the bottom, from the hem at one side all the way up round the back of the neck and down past the waist to the hem on the other side. So you can do this all in one go, and again a centimetre seam allowance. Just match your notches, keep the edges of your lining to the edges of your coat as you go. Okay, now let's get it all the right way around again. And this is one of those magic moments where all of a sudden it looks like a sort of lined coat, really, which we're pretty much there. We're pretty much done. There's some more hairy bits of my lining. Let's just trim a few of those down carefully. Check that the lining's gone in smoothly, that there's no tucks or pulls. It's all looking rather lush. Oh, there's a pin at the bottom there. Let's take that one out. And then we're just going to give that a little press again, all the way around. So now we're going to anchor this lining down, which I think some people skip this, but it's really worth doing. Look, this bit can come apart and look quite baggy and just not very attractive. So I'm just going to take these seams here, take this seam allowance, and I'm just going to stitch. Oh, if you can see, I've opened the seam allowance and I'm just going to stitch it together just in one little place. It doesn't need to be all the way around the neck, but just doing it for a couple of centimetres will just help to keep the collar flat and together. Look, there you go, you can see it better there. So let's turn it the right way out again. And that will keep that collar looking really nice. There you go, it's not going anywhere. Next we're going to do the lining to the coat, and we're going to do a little bit of the waist. So I'll just do a little bit of the centre back, I think, and a bit of the side seams. Again, it doesn't need to be all the way along, so maybe just a centimetre of the seam allowances there on the sides, and a similar at the back. Again, it just stops it shifting around too much when you're wearing it or taking it on and off. Lovely, that's all anchored down there. And the last bit that I quite like to do is under the arms as well, the armpits, because again, I hate that when you take your coat off and your sleeve all turns inside out, doesn't it? Your lining comes out of your sleeve. So again, just underneath there. So it's sort of the side seam to side seam underneath the armpit there. Again, stops it moving around. So that's anchored really nicely now, I think. That'll make all the difference when you're wearing it. So we've got to the hem. We're nearly there. Now I'm going to bag this out. You can do them separately if you want to. There should be a notch there of the fold line, and I'm just going to stitch up to that centimetre seam allowance on the facing. Do that both sides. So there we go, trim that corner off, give it a little grade just to reduce the bulk, and then I can turn it through and give it a press before I stitch my linings together. Just give it a little wiggle to turn it through. Okay, so that's a nice edge to there, and then I'm literally going to, oh, hairy lining, I'm literally going to just turn this the other way through again and stitch the lining to the hem. So a centimetre seam allowance again. Your lining is a little bit shorter than your coat, so it will naturally pull the hem up when it comes to giving it a press. So I'm going to go from one corner to the side seam and then the other corner to the side seam, and then I stitch from the side seam towards the centre back. I just like to do it in stages, but you can do it all in one if you want. Obviously you'll need to leave a little bit open, but you can see there, look, it's all nice and neat. It will just need a press. So there we go, I've given it a gentle press and I've just got this bit at the centre back now that's open, and I'm just going to sort of put that little pleat in, that excess, and turn up the centimetre seam allowance, pin it to the centimetre seam allowance of the coat, and then I'm just going to hand stitch that little bit. I know some people like to go in through the armhole and leave a gap in the arm or in the side seam. It's purely your preference. Do what suits you. I'm just going to stitch this little bit by hand. Oh, blunt pin, get rid of that. So I've chosen to do snap fasteners, these lovely big chunky ones, and put a sort of decorative button on my coats. But you can do real buttons and buttonholes if you desire. This centre, well, it's not centre front, is it? It's off centre, but this edge matches this dart. So that's how you know. And that's the break point that I'm pointing to there. So this is where my button needs to go, and you know that that's in the right place because it's butted up against the dart. So I've got my big popper, and I'm going to put that there, and then I'm going to put another big popper this side as well, and again that edge should reach that dart, so it overlaps by that amount underneath. So I'm just going to mark where I want my popper. I'm going to put that one nearer, closer to the waistline than the other one, and just mark on the inside as well where it needs to go, the other half. Do try your coat on once you've made it and make sure these are in the right place for you, even if you've made a toile, because you know sometimes a little bit of seam allowance extra or a little bit less, and you might need your popper or button in a slightly different place, so it's definitely worth checking. Okay, so I'm just going to hand sew these on. I think this is a nice easy way to get a really nice finish on a coat, is to use these big press studs, just hand sewn on, and then like I said, I've got this lovely button that you can have some fun with to pop on the outside. Now normally I'd sit down in front of the TV with a nice cup of tea and do lots of lovely buttonhole knots and beautiful embroidery thread around these, but it's a demonstration so I can't do that. So I'm literally just doing speed sewing here, literally. We have speeded it up as well. Just popping that one on there. Okay, so then you need to, again, double check, line up where your other one wants to go. That's the centre. And I'll stitch that one on there. So I've been away and stitched on my poppers. There you go. There they are. And I'm going to just put a lovely big decorative button on mine. Again, you could do 2 buttons. You don't have to have a button at all. You could just use the poppers or press studs. I've got this rather fancy button. I'm just going to sew it to the top, which can be a little bit tricky to get behind the poppers, but I'm just going to secure my threads. Again, as I'm not going to be effectively using it to button and unbutton, it doesn't need to be nailed onto the coat, so we can just do a few stitches to hold it. And that just gives a little illusion of having that big button fastening it. So there we go. That is job done, really. And I hope you've enjoyed making this. And I hope that you end up with something that looks a bit like this. Enjoy.